What's up, everybody? Welcome to the remainder of the chapter 16 lecture recording on urinalysis. So I'll go ahead and pick right back up where we left off. Share screen. There we go. We should be able to see that now without any other distractions. All right, cool. So where we left off, we were talking about the physical exam of urine. And the physical exam really refers to things that we can do or see with our senses. So things like we'll go back in one slide, the volume, so how much urine is in the sample, the color of it, and we've got some examples of colors on the previous slide right there, as well as on Moodle. There's a bunch of different colors there too. Besides that, other physical exam components are transparency. So that is the amount of dissolved substances that are in the urine that make it either more or less um, easy to see through, right? Can you see light going all the way through it? Or is there a lot of particles that are blocking that light? And finally, urine odor. So we're talking about things that you don't always have to or get to um, pick up on because nobody expects you to smell people's urine, but this is something that can tell you something about the function of somebody's kidneys and their overall health. For instance, sweet smelling urine can indicate things like a UTI or even diabetes mellitus because there's an excess of sugar. Foul smelling urine could indicate bacteria. Now the bacteria are actually eating whatever's in the urine, and maybe it's the sugar. So sometimes you'll see that UTIs go hand in hand with diabetes in the sense that you're more at risk for things like a UTI if you have diabetes. And I should say it right here too, just so we know it, is that women tend to be at higher risk for developing a UTI because they have a shorter urethra compared to men. Or maybe a better way to say this is that people with a vagina are more likely to have a UTI compared to people with a penis because the urethra is shorter with the people with a vagina, and um, the urethra is also closer to the anus compared to a person with a penis, where the penis that distances the urethra from the anus. So there's less bacteria that's coming in contact with it. All right, so moving on to the chemical examination of urine, and you're going to be doing this in lab where you focus on and then do a checkoff on both the physical and the chemical exam. So for the chemical, you're actually not really relying on your senses to diagnose or to even measure anything. You're relying on chemicals. So with this, you're going to get a strip of paper with different patches of color on it and you dip it into the urine. And what's going to happen is different parts of that will have chemical reactions that make the color change, depending on if there's more or less of any substance. So let's take a closer look on the next slide. So we see things like glucose, see things like the pH. There will always be a pH. Everything has a pH, so it'll tell you if it's high or low. Protein, ketones, blood, urobilinogen, nitrites, leukocytes, and specific gravity. Now, you don't really want any of these in your pee. I mean, if you have glucose, it is considered abnormal because you should have saved your excess. You should have saved glucose, but if you have too much in your blood, then there is something going on, so you're going to pee it out. The things that aren't really like a trouble are here is the pH because you should have a pH. Now, if the pH changes and becomes too acidic or too basic, then that will be an issue. But you shouldn't see protein or ketones or blood. Urobilinogen, that stuff should not really be in the urine. Nitrites, this is going to indicate more like a UTI. So bacteria like to basically convert nitrates, which are a normal part, into nitrites. So presence of nitrites does sort of indicate that there's bacteria within there. Leukocytes, those are white blood cells, so you shouldn't see that. They shouldn't have actually been filtered from your blood into the urine. So unless they are coming their way in response to an infection, so that could be showing that there are signs of infection in the urinary tract. And then specific gravity, as we talked about in class, that's the concentration of solid material in the urine, or you could say of solutes. So things like salt or sugars, whatever you want to call it. Now, sort of applying these things towards the different tests that you're going to be doing in lab as well as an MA in clinic. So things like drug screening right here. We've probably all had to do those to get a job. I'm sure you did to get into this MA program. But with this, it's often that you are going to have something called a chain of custody, where this is making sure that you always document who has had custody, or at least who has been supervising the patient's urine sample every step of the way, right? So oftentimes this becomes somebody's, had some sort of legal issue where they have to get drug tested. Maybe they, have it for their parole or probation. And so what's going to happen is they're going to come in, they're going to give a urine sample. And from the time that you give them the cup, you, for the most part, are sort of monitoring them either peeing into it or making sure they didn't bring anything else in there that they're going to dump into the cup instead of their own pee. And then you are going to either be, documenting who took that cup from one place to the next until it finally got to the lab where they're going to analyze it, or it's you have brought it to the lab yourself or you've done the test yourself. So you're really just documenting the entire step of the process, that it's been under supervision by a medical professional, so that somebody can't say later on, well, somebody tampered with this. And so there, I have no drugs in my system, but this test says I do, but that's not legit, because if you didn't document that it's been watched the entire time, that chain of custody has been broken. Now, urine pregnancy test, this is probably one of the most common urinary wave tests out there. For the most part, I mean, you just drop a 1 or 2 drops of urine, and it's looking for HCG. That's that human chorionic gonadotropin. It's a hormone that's produced by the body when you are pregnant. And so times that they're going to order this is, one, if you think you're pregnant and they just want to confirm it, or if they want to make sure that you're not pregnant before doing some of things like prescribing birth control pills, right? Before a provider puts you on pills that will damage a fetus, they want to make sure there's not a growing fetus inside of you. Radiographic studies, we're talking about things like an X-ray or a CT scan. These are things that have a lot of X-ray damaging potential that's going to go into the body. And if there is a fetus in there, they want to make sure that, uh, I guess, they can protect as much as possible. But the best is just to not even at all do things like an X-ray or a CT scan if you are pregnant, because that is putting a lot of potential damage to you as well as the fetus. Now, again, these pregnancy tests are based on the detection of that hormone HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay. But just because, and this goes for anybody who's taken a pregnancy test, just because you got a positive pregnancy test doesn't mean that it's going to be a normal pregnancy, right? Because there could be some situations, the examples here, ectopic pregnancy, which is where the fetus basically implants in the fallopian tubes, right? And then that's not the uterus. So that's not the right condition for the growth of a fetus. And so that's life-threatening for the mom as well as for the baby, right? So just because it's a positive test doesn't mean that you should just say, great, I'm gonna just let this ride out until, my first OB appointment. I would recommend that you if you get a pregnancy test, you should schedule a visit with your provider just to make sure everything is on the correct course as far as the development of the fetus and where you're at and your own health and things like that. Other things, it could be let's see, like different types of cancer can actually make your body release HCG2. So that is going to send another positive test. So it's like, yes, you are potentially pregnant if it's like an ectopic pregnancy, but it's not going to be a good one necessarily. Or it could be that your body's inappropriately sending out that HCG hormone. Now with them, they have these internal quality controls. If you look, there's usually like a little, I mean, this is like a 20-year-old picture, but pretty much all of the waived pregnancy tests, they're going to have some indicator that doesn't just, one indicator that says, pregnant or not pregnant, but there's going to be another part of it that says, is this test valid or not? Usually it's like 1 or 2 lines. And if one line is not, it's like the top line indicates the test is good or not. The bottom line, if it's present or not, indicates pregnancy or not pregnancy. So there's always a way internally to check the quality control of these. And finally, on this, if you're going to be using pregnant, or you're going to be urine, period, to be testing for anything, not just pregnancy, but things like drug screening and stuff like that, it's important that the best is going to be using it warm, fresh from the source, right? But if you can't test it immediately, you can store it at 39 degrees Fahrenheit in a fridge for up to 24 hours. I'm gonna I'm bold of that because I'm probably gonna ask you that on a quiz or an exam, right? But make sure you thaw to room temperature, just in case it's starting to get icy or it's starting to any of that stuff. Just make sure it's warmed back up to room temperature before you actually test it. Now, urinalysis report. This is going to be the printout of what they find inside of the urinalysis. And this is typically not really done by you. This would be like a report like this would be if you sent it to a lab and they gave you this. You might fill out something that looks similar to this, but just know if you see something and it's already completed like this, it's not because you're going to be doing the exact same thing. You'll be doing something that's kind of similar. Most of these tests that we're doing, they're looking for one thing, right? Pregnancy, non-pregnancy. One thing that you might have to create one of these for is a drug test. If it's looking for 5 to 10 different types of drugs, then you could indicate positive or negative for multiple things. But this has so many different things on it that most likely a computer or a technician is going to be generating one of these, right? This just shows all kinds of stuff, like the physical components of the urine, as well as the presence of different chemical components. Okay, when it was done, who was it by, who's a provider, things like that. And for the last part of this chapter, I want to talk about microscopes. Now, I believe microscopes, that's actually embedded within chapter 20. I think that's the microbiology chapter in the textbook. They've moved it a little bit in the last few textbooks, but this is the time that we talk about it because as far as the skills of an MA goes, this is when you use a microscope. You're going to get the urine sample. You're going to spin it down in a centrifuge, and then you're going to pipe that out the little sediment at the bottom. We call it supernatant, and it's this little stuff at the very bottom that it's all the chunks, right? It's like it would be similar like if you spun blood and the hematocrit at the bottom. That's the heaviest stuff. Well, the heaviest stuff in urine is going to be all the sediment, the crystals that basically fling out to the sides. So then what you're going to be doing is pipetting that out, putting it onto a microscope slide and loading it onto a microscope. And then you're going to turn the microscope on, focus on something, and then the provider is going to take over from there. It's not your job to look at it and see and say, this is a crystal, this is a white blood cell, things like that. That's a provider's job. But it's your job to get that microscope all ready for them to just look at and quickly move to the next thing. So as far as a microscope goes, I would like you to know these terms right here. This is anatomy of the microscope. On your final exam, I will have this exact picture on there, and there will be 3 or 4, I think, of these different names that will be missing that you need to fill in. Okay, so just understanding the big ones. And for me, the big ones really are like the lenses. This is where you look in with your eyes. These are called the ocular lens because that's where your eyes go. The objective lens down here, you'll play with this in lab. There's 3 to 4, depending on the microscope, that you can change to get higher or lower magnification to look right here on the stage where you're going to put your slide. Okay. The slide holder is this cool little C-clamp that holds the slide there so it doesn't move. The light source is directly under that, and it's refracted up onto the light. And then really important is the coarse and fine adjustment. So the coarse adjustment and fine adjustment, they're usually on the same knob, but you turn the knob more quickly with the coarse adjustment so you can quickly zoom in and out. And the fine adjustment, of course, is to get that fine detail. And I should say one more thing, not that you have to know this for testing. This is called a compound microscope. It's kind of basic. I mean, it works way better than our own eyes, but it's not like an electron microscope where people are looking at tiny, tiny, tiny things at the atomic level, okay? Now, when you look inside of a microscope and you're looking at a specimen, most likely you're going to see something, right? It could be some type of sediment, and that sediment is just another name for the solid material that's inside of the urine. It could be something that is totally benign, meaning not a problem. So that could be something like maybe that's some toilet paper that was in the pee if they didn't clean well enough. Maybe that's some of the epithelial like cells, which are essentially like you could think about it as like skin cells inside the body, as well as some skin cells outside the body. And it or some of those cells that are lining the urinary tract, that happens too. Those can indicate something, but that's not really the issue here. What you're looking for on off what the provider is looking for mostly are different types of pathogens like yeast or bacteria or protozoa or things like that. Or they're looking for things like white blood cells, red blood cells, other things that really shouldn't be present in urine, but that they can deduce some um, pathologies based off of, right? So the preferred collection method, if you're going to do this, is do the clean catch midstream. That way you're getting rid of as many of the potential, like, unwanted stuff like toilet paper or sperm or things like that that you don't want. And the complexity of this, it's interesting. Getting the urine that's a moderate complexity test, just like getting urine. But when you actually put the once the once the provider is looking at the slide and then diagnosing what it is, that is no longer a moderate complexity, right? So the complexity of the test, just to get urine, spin it down, put it onto a slide, and focus it on a slide on something is totally uh, the waved, like the lowest complexity, like all of our MA tests for the most part. But the provider can show you later on to do more moderate stuff, like if they want to show you, hey, this is what this type of cell looks like. This is what this looks like. No matter what, they always have the final say. But just loading this into a microscope, that's totally modern or waved complexity. And this last slide, this shows some abnormal findings. We talked about things like epithelial cells, which are kind of like just skin. Skin is not the best way to generalize that. If we go way back into A&P, there's 4 types of tissue in the body, right? We have muscle tissue, nerve tissue or neural tissue, um, connective tissue, so things like bone and blood. And the last one is epithelial tissue. And that's like what our skin, our mucous membranes, and a lot of the stuff inside of like our GI and respiratory tract is made of, including our urinary tract. And so some of those cells that line that, those are epithelial cells. So sometimes those can slough off or die and they're present in the urine. Other things like bacteria, crystals form when there's sediment that's concentrated and it just sort of binds together and then comes down. Erythrocytes, so like white blood cells is the leukocytes, red blood cells is the erythrocytes, yeasts, etc. So that's other stuff that you find. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So that was the remaining few slides from what we didn't get to yesterday in lecture. I hope that's helpful. And now I'm going to go record the lecture recording for part 2 of chapter 11, the one that Marty did. All right. Thanks a lot, folks.